Hi, everybody.
Welcome to GrowUp, guys. Today we've got James Todaro. He is a doctor. He went to Columbia University. Can you give us a little more of your background, James?
Sure. So, as you said, I graduated from Columbia University. That's where I received my medical degree. That was followed by completion of 4 years in residency. That's when I actually took a step after finishing residency away from medicine for a little bit to kind of manage investments, which I was doing throughout medical school and residency as well. And then it kind of brought me back to medicine when COVID started back in January, February. It caught my attention both from a medical standpoint and then the effect on the American economy, and kept kind of digging deeper and deeper into it, and studied a whole range of subjects from potential therapeutics to masks to the effects of lockdowns, schools, and have still been involved today and continue to stay involved as long as I'm useful.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think you've given people a lot to think about since the start of this. I mean, I think one of the natural places to start is this Danish mask study. So JAMA, the Lancet, among a bunch of others, refused to publish this, and it was just recently published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. It's the largest randomized controlled trial to date with over 6,000 subjects, and in it, what did they find?
Yeah, so first, to give a little bit of backstory on that study, this was first brought to the attention, I think Alex Berenson did a good job first maybe bringing this to the public's eye, that these top medical journals were not accepting this publication, which I think that if that didn't get out in the public space where people started commenting, saying, and kind of asking for the results of this study, it probably would have just been continually pushed under the rug, because what we've seen throughout a number of these medical journals is they really only publish content that supports the mainstream narrative. They're very reluctant and most of the time don't publish the content. And I've heard of many authors, some very notable prestigious authors, that are getting rejected from these journals for anything that questions the effects of lockdowns, for anything that questions what constitutes herd immunity. And so I think there's enough public pressure for the study results to get out that even though New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, and JAMA refused to publish that, I think when it came to the desk of the Annals of Internal Medicine, they probably limited the scope of what the study could talk about and address, and made sure they have enough content in there that maybe was still bolstered the mainstream media message where then they felt comfortable releasing that study. But as you said, it was a study in about 6,000 subjects, a little over that, where half the subjects received a type 2, I believe, surgical mask. So that's a medical face mask, not an N95, but a medium grade, surgical mask with the gaps. And then the other subjects were not advised to wear masks. And I think the average amount of time spent outside for each of the groups was about 4.5 hours or so. And this was at a time in Denmark when it was done that the general community, I don't think, was generally wearing masks. And I think there were some social distancing measures in place. But what they found was that there was really no significant difference in those individuals who wore masks or those who did not in becoming infected. It was about, I think it was a 1.8% in the medical mask group, and then a 2.1% in the group that didn't wear masks. And this was not statistically significant, and it wasn't actually really close to being statistically significant. The p-value was a 0.33, which for most of your listeners probably know, but it really only reaches a significance at 0.05, and maybe can be considered trending towards significance at 0.1. But this was really not even close. And actually the confidence interval even ranged to the point where the masks could be considered harmful. It leaned in the direction of them not being harmful, but it could be anywhere in that category. Now, it's important to interpret these results under the right lens, though, because this isn't the study that tells us everything we need to know about masks, but it is the biggest randomized controlled trial we have on this. This is something that we didn't know. There's lab studies, there's theoretical studies. They can put the mannequins and put a mask on it and see how much transfers between the two, which those can be helpful, but this is really the most robust study we have in masks. And we really have to use that information, the best evidence available. We can't sit there and say, there's this flaw, there was some dropout in the study, they weren't spending enough time outside. But so based on the results, this study essentially shows, and as the best evidence available, that this type of mask will not really protect you from becoming infected any more than, say, not wearing a mask. Now, go ahead.
I would just say, detractors to it would say, oh, well, what they found was that it didn't stop, it didn't show efficacy in terms of stopping you from getting it, but they didn't look at you giving it to others. Now, my sort of first reaction, not a doctor here, so I'll tell you what my reaction was and you can tell me if I'm crazy. My first reaction was like, okay, so if it is showing that there's no efficacy of it doing anything to protect me from getting it, is there a magic other side of the mask that is suddenly going to do what it's saying it can't do in the reverse? Like that just doesn't make logical sense to me, especially given the fact that all I see when I go out is I see people touching the mask. They're touching their face, touching their face, touching their face. That's all I see. So it would actually seem to me that if I was going to have a hypothesis here, it would be that based on that anecdotal experience of seeing thousands of people touching face masks on the outside of it, I would think that it actually is doing a little bit worse on the flip side of the mask. Am I wrong?
So it kind of becomes a little bit of a numbers game, but as you said, you're exactly right. Like from what they studied, they were looking at protecting the individual, not on whether this increases or decreases transmission of the virus. And that's what a lot of people, are kind of debating in there. But just to clarify one point, the CDC and the World Health Organization still says that this mask protects you from becoming infected to some degree by wearing it. So they, to my knowledge, have not updated their recommendations or guidelines on that aspect of it. So when people sit there and say, well, we always knew it didn't protect you, it was for anyone else, that's not really true. They were kind of arguing that it helps in both ways. Now, when it comes to the argument on, if it's not protecting you from getting infected, does it still stop the virus from spreading and going the opposite way in the mask? And that's where, I kind of rely a little bit on the laboratory studies where they had nebulizers on a mannequin, put a mask on it, had it in a closed container, had another mannequin with or without a mask, and they kind of cultured the virus and saw if there was transmission between the two. And based on that study, because that's some of the early evidence we have for this transmission hypothesis, is that an N95 mask that's properly worn, that's taped, and we're talking about a mannequin again, and so it ignores all your points about touching the mask, adjusting them, not sealed, people with facial hair, all this. They still found that the mask was only protecting. This is an N95 mask taped on a mannequin, was only about 80 to 90% effective at blocking the virus, and kind of similar both directions. Now, the medical grade mask was then like 40 to 50% stopped it. Now that's where it kind of becomes a little bit more of a numbers game where, okay, if you are exposed, or there's 1,000, let's say, viral particles coming your way, if you cut that in half and it's 500, is that still enough to get you infected? Usually when we talk about how much virus is necessary to infect you, we're talking about kind of magnitudes, like orders of 10 different. Like, is it 100? Is it 1,000? Is it 10,000? It's not like, 150 you will get infected, but 100 you won't. And so even though if a mask does, let's say, stop the spread of 40, 50, even 80% of those viral particles, there's a good chance, at least in my mind, that it's still not going to change that magnitude of difference enough to stop you from getting infected or to stop you from spreading it. Now, That being said, I'd be open to more evidence. The one thing I would say, though, about mask studies going forward is I don't think we're going to see many more of them. The mainstream media and everything has already kind of imprinted and put their foot down on requiring masks, and we're really seeing this all around the world. And it's probably their narrative for this is so strong and has such the support of most governments and local officials that I would argue that they might even find it unethical. Not saying that their opinion is right, but unethical to even not have a group that doesn't wear masks. Now, maybe there's some country that, like, maybe Switzerland might do a study like that. But so my prediction going forward is this randomized controlled trial that we have on masks is probably going to be the last of the randomized controlled trials on masks. Which is unfortunate because given this is such a controversial point, it seems like more evidence would be better.
Yep. Right. So, I mean, I had a question. Most people just read the headlines, and the quote from the author of that mass study, or one of the co-authors of it, said something to the effect that, the conclusion, so which people are only reading conclusions, they're not trained or do they necessarily know how to read the study, interpret it as it is. They're saying that based on those comments that there's no evidence to indicate that we don't need masks. So, how do you, from your perspective, how do you tell people or educate people, what supersedes which? Does the study supersede the expert? Are we in an authority argument? I mean, how should we gauge information? Are we not to trust ourselves with actual science and studies, or are we going to defer to the expert saying, it doesn't matter what the science is, I'm telling you it's not effective?
There's also, I mean, I would say too, like assumed risk, you know, like some healthy people may have said, you know what, I don't feel like I want to take the risk of getting the most rushed vaccine in history, so I would rather get immunity by having it.
Well, let's stick. I just want to stick to that study. You know, what would you say to that? Because that's really what's being run right now to discredit the study, is those comments from the person who authored the study.
Sure. Yeah. So I know in the medical field, we kind of triage or tier evidence, right? You have a randomized controlled trial, which is the best form of evidence. Then we have observational studies, which aren't randomized, but still based on observation. And then you get into kind of case reports, expert opinion, and then anecdotal evidence. Mm-hmm. And so, expert opinion is way down here compared to a randomized controlled trial results.
Yeah.
So, right. and you have to think that, these authors face a tremendous amount of pressure to, not go out there and maybe state. I think in the study, they kind of stated what the results were, and they stuck to that kind of closely. But I think I did see comments maybe elsewhere where the author said, it is still mass, could be helpful, or it shows that they are helpful, but just not to a significant degree, maybe, or not to the 50% level for the study, but it could be zero. We don't know, but it seemed like they still leaned on the side of saying just wear masks. And that's where it comes down to the general public is who, if they don't feel comfortable reading these studies for themselves, then they're just down to who they trust. So whether some people trust, Dr. Fauci or, those experts, Scott Gottlieb, or whether they trust, experts in Scott Atlas, the other side of the aisle. And, unfortunately, I think a lot of people already made up their minds in some ways on who they trust in these two categories. But so I don't know, because there is definitely a disconnect. Some of these studies are hard to read. I think the mass study was actually not that complicated, but there's certainly a number of other studies on various aspects of this pandemic, like T-cell immunity and such, that it would be hard for the public to, I think, dissect through and figure out the results. So I don't have a great answer for you, unfortunately. But
no, I think you hit on a good point. Just to remind everybody that not only do we possess the ability to be critical thinkers for ourselves, but that we need to question people that are just, using that authoritative argument of just, well, I'm the expert. You don't need to know the science. I don't need to explain it. We don't need to talk about your questions about the study, but just trust what I'm saying. Just take my quote, run with that, and use it as propaganda is really dangerous.
I think to your point, what's really dangerous right now is we've gotten to a point where when people ask questions, it's called the denial of science, when it used to be that asking questions was the process of science. That was a natural thing that people were supposed to do, is question results, question the orthodoxy, and sort of figure out, hey, have we tested this in every way possible to make sure that the conclusion that everybody's going with, it's popular, is correct. What do you think the damage from that type of behavioral change around science it looks like in the long term?
So to go back, you're absolutely right. There's really a suppression of open discussion at multiple levels. At the very basic social media platform level, we've obviously seen a suppression to a tremendous extent across YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, where accounts are getting suspended for saying something that doesn't fit the mainstream narrative. Then it's even the next level where, as I talked about, these scientific and medical journals are even suppressing content that doesn't fit the mainstream narrative, which that's supposed to be the place where, as long as the study was found to be robust and valid in its conclusion, then it should be published. It shouldn't be, we're worried about the general public, how they'll react to this study. That's not how science works. It's supposed to be independent of the general public. It's supposed to be sticking to facts, science. And then there's the final thing on anyone that goes against this expert opinion is, really attacked to a very aggressive extent by the mainstream media. And whether it be CNN or Huffington Post or even just on social media, there's this definitely closed-minded view where if you say something that is against mainstream media, you are a quack, you are a conspiracy theorist, and there's really nothing that you can say that people will kind of open their eyes to. Now, the ramifications of that, as you asked, Robbie, is it really breaks down the scientific process. When, hopefully, long term, when maybe not in a pandemic where all the, I don't know. So the thing is with this pandemic that's interesting is you have so many eyes focused on this disease, right? Because it affects everyone in one way or another, whether they're in lockdowns, whether they're worried about getting the virus. And so we have the benefit of having a lot of independent investigators, which include myself, looking into this disease to try to find the truth or whatnot. I think that was missing in science before. And so the science was much less controversial, at least it seemed, say a year ago.
Yeah.
But part of me wonders whether that was used to the advantage maybe of pharmaceutical companies. And it's not just me saying this. Editors-in-chief of New England Journal of Medicine, of the Lancet, have bemoaned this situation as well, where these pharmaceutical companies were able to kind of push through studies and publish studies that were really slanted toward them showing that their drug had an effect. And so I think science and medicine, because these medical journals are the gatekeepers and they receive a lot of their funding from these pharmaceutical companies, I think it has been corrupted. And so we're really seeing that in much more in the public space of this corruption. So I would say that the scientific process, at least in medicine, seems like it's been breaking down for a while, and now it's just getting more into the open media. Public sphere, exactly, because there's more people looking at it.
I would just look at remdesivir. Remdesivir at the onset of like the first outbreak, when people started talking about hydroxychloroquine and stuff, the media and the journals and all those, but everybody jumped on it. The World Health Organization was one of them that jumped on it and said, "Do not use this. It's not recommended." And they went full bore on it. It took them 8 months to do the same thing about remdesivir because Fauci touted it as, the end all be all for fighting COVID. Now they've found that maybe that efficacy is not there, and that maybe, it was exaggerated in terms of the initial studies on it that were done by the pharmaceutical company. So I think that's a good example of that. That it's sort of different roles depending on the media narrative and who's supporting what, and Fauci's support bought remdesivir 8 months of wide scale use across the globe.
And a contract with the government. I think the government's, so it bought a couple things. So if you look at Gilead stock, it really kind of peaked, I think, when Dr. Fauci announced its benefit in the Oval Office. And then you kind of just see its stock go down. And that announcement, that kind of press release before the formal study even came out, and then the EUA that followed, the emergency use authorization, really bought Gilead, I think, couple $1 billion contract with the government to provide remdesivir. And you're exactly right. Many months later, it then came out where, this probably isn't that effective, if effective at all, which Fauci didn't even, he was very excited, which was interesting when he announced it, because it didn't actually change mortality at all. It decreased the hospital stay, by a day or two, but that was really about it. So I was surprised he was so excited about it, but maybe not surprised if there are other conflicts of interest in this. But yeah, so that's exactly right. So, and then on the flip side, you can hear, about hydroxychloroquine, where they published, I know you're aware of the Lancet study that was published showing hydroxychloroquine wasn't effective and actually harmful. And it's very interesting, when independent investigators were first talking about how the data didn't look right, it was considered a conspiracy theory. That was like another thing, like this is a top medical journal. There's no way they'd publish a study that was fraudulent. And probably now, if we were saying that about a study today, it'd probably be censored, because these social media platforms are censoring even more aggressively. And then lo and behold, it was a totally fraudulent study. But that's how quick the public is to kind of just go with a narrative and then try to suppress anyone that's outside of that. And, the retraction of that study of that magnitude, as you know, is huge and really unusual.
Yeah, I would say it's not even the public. I think it's largely driven by the media pretending the public thinks something. I mean,
absolutely.
Some sort of a wide scale reality that the media pretends there's a reality and a truth that doesn't exist. You look a week before the election, they were saying Trump was losing by 17 points in Wisconsin. The margin in Wisconsin right now is about 20,000 votes, which is 0.7%. So not even 1% difference. And that was an A-rated poll from ABC Washington Post. They spin the narrative they want to be true, and that's sort of and they try to make it out to be the large scale public agreement, and that's just not the case. I can't take anything seriously they say anymore about wide scale. Oh, everybody feels this way or that way on any issue. It's a farce to me. But
I mean, yeah.
you brought something up I thought was really interesting before the show, and I don't want to word it incorrectly, but you were talking about like, when does the mask thing end, basically, like you were saying, like, like in flu season, as this goes on after COVID. Can you reword it?
Right. Well, if it's a moral argument now, because it's no longer scientific argument, because there are these studies indicating that it is not as effective as they've purported. It now becomes a moral, social issue. And so my question is, saving flu lives, flu deaths, colds, people with compromised immune systems. Is the mask ever going to come off?
Yeah, so that's an argument I kind of bring up is, the flu influenza virus is an airborne respiratory virus, just like COVID. And there are a substantial number of flu deaths every year. There's, between 30 and 50,000 in the US, about 500,000 globally. So 500,000 flu deaths, yet we never proposed to the public, the mass general public, to wear masks for the flu. So at what point do you sit there and say, okay, COVID, now we have X amount, whether it's even 3 or 4-fold the flu. Is that the point when we now institute masks? And then where does that end? If COVID goes away and we think that these masks are effective for the flu, do we just continue wearing masks forever now? Especially in the absence of any, additional evidence or randomized controlled trials, robust evidence for against it. And then you have even the, experts up there like Dr. Fauci saying that even after the vaccine comes out and people are vaccinated, you still have to wear masks because they have that 10% or 5% that could still get infected. So it's really, where do you draw a line? Is this where we wear a mask? Let's even pretend they're effective. Do we wear a mask until every single respiratory, death comes to 0, or is it less than 100 or less than the 10,000? I don't know. As a, someone that is very a staunch advocate for personal freedom and personal choices, I am opposed to government mandates on wearing masks. I think that, people should assess maybe the evidence or trust their experts, whichever side of the aisle they're on, and their own risk factors, and then make the reasonable choice, whether it's staying at home, whether it's social distancing, whether it's wearing a mask, and in that case, maybe a more robust mask. Maybe you'd wear an N95 as opposed to a surgical mask. So I believe in that freedom for people to choose, but the way the experts are talking, they're acting like the mask thing is here to stay, which is very unfortunate. As someone that likes to communicate with people in person, and anyone that's social does, it's really hard to build a relationship with someone when you have a mask over their face. You can't see them smile, you can't see their expressions, whether they're joking or not, it's muffled, you're familiar with it.
And just to drive that point home, Dr. Fauci did say, even after there's a vaccine out, he wants everybody to continue wearing masks. And the full story hasn't been written yet in terms of the vaccine, how many times you're going to have it, in terms of the totality of your life. Are you going to have to do it every year, every other year? They haven't even been very clear about that. I would say, and we'll get into the vaccine more, but on the mask note, I want to say there was actually a study in October that claimed masks were a huge success because 1,083 counties with mask mandates had decreases in their hospitalization rates. But now that study has also been withdrawn because those areas had increased rates of COVID where they had analyzed. Doesn't this just drive home how important it is to look at all the science and not censor science after it comes to a conclusion, especially if one doesn't fit the narrative?
Absolutely. So I tweeted about that study as well back when, right after it was retracted. But it's funny because before that study was retracted, I was having an argument with another former colleague of mine who knows science, a PhD, and was arguing that same point. Like, these certain counties that have these mask mandates, the infections aren't going up. And I was like, that you're picking and choosing counties, and let's take a wait and see. And just like the study, they picked and choose, and they were 2 weeks delayed on the infections going up. But you're exactly right. So infections started to skyrocket in those counties overall, and so they quickly retracted the study, saying, well, we got to look more into it because they're going up. And that's what we're seeing around the world, right? Europe, mask mandates have been in place for a very long time. US, many states have been very strict about mask mandates. I just saw a physician, I think it's maybe an emergency medicine physician in Maryland, who said, absolutely critical. Our hospitals are filling up for people to wear masks and social distance. Maryland has a 95% compliance rate with wearing masks. They are the second highest, first or second highest in the country for this. So at what point do you sit there and say, okay, we did all that, the numbers are still, cases and then deaths are still rising dramatically. You can always argue, well, we decreased it. But that's not really science. That's saying, maybe it decreased it, maybe it didn't. There's no real evidence for that. And especially considering that a lot of the states they're all rising. It's not like any one state really seemed to do this very well and their masks are working. And we saw the same thing across Europe. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you look at where the virus originated, China. It's a very highly masked population. It's ingrained in their culture. And the fact that it was able to proliferate in that area despite the use of masks, I mean, I feel like these situations are conveniently absolved from the space of the internet information.
Well, yeah, Asia is actually a little bit interesting because we largely believe that the virus started in Wuhan, in China. And yet a lot of Asia, if you look at their coronavirus deaths per million, it's extremely low. Like we're talking about 5 to 10 kind of deaths per million. Meanwhile, the US, I haven't checked the recent numbers, but I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 deaths per million. And the Europe is seeing something between 500 and 800 as well. So magnitude's different. And given that we implemented all these masks, they're probably pretty close to China, to South Korea, to Japan's level at this point in mask compliance. And we don't have numbers even close to how low theirs are. Not even close, which makes me think that it's not the masks in those countries that are working. It's like the reason South Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan have 5 to 10 deaths per million is not because they wear masks 2% of the time more than we do. We've been doing masks for a long time now with a lot of lockdowns in place. I think a stronger argument would be that in those regions, there's some degree of immunity. It's unclear whether it's T cells or some other immunological element. And for T cells, your body has two types of immune response. There's B cells, which make antibodies, and there's T cells, which is really more of a cell-mediated immunity, which seems to be longer lasting than antibodies. And there's some argument that these countries, whether it's somehow coronaviruses are more common there, which I believe they are, they've built up an immunity where you're not seeing those deaths. Because the mask and social distancing compliance, I don't think it can account it for such a huge difference in deaths per million. Yeah. Especially when we talk about China, Japan, South Korea, where people are very crowded. This isn't I'm in Michigan. Michigan is going to be very different from the crowded conditions and not always clean sanitary conditions. In
I would actually say very unsanitary. I've been all over China to these areas. It's much less sanitary than in America. And you still are seeing these lower rates. That was actually, you answered one of our questions from our viewer, Susie, who was asking about this being possibly because of a possible immunity. Is that something any studies have backed up or anybody working on that?
I'm not familiar with studies that have, it's really tough to share, I think, results between maybe China and the US. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of exchange in studies. So I haven't seen any looking at, let's say, T cell immunity, where they have a higher T cell immunity or, for those regions. I do know that they did a study in the US that seemed to show that those with a high T cell count versus those with the low T cell count, the people with the high T cell count didn't get infected with COVID, whereas those who did show antibodies that they became affected at some point. But to my knowledge, there's not really much evidence that's available that shows that China maybe has some degree of this other form of protective immunity.
Right. Well, yeah, and also, we also have to question the credibility of a country that also put all these measures in place to make sure they weren't held responsible, not to mention they have millions of people in concentration camps. So I don't think we can really gauge how many deaths were actually accurately reported. So it's probably not a good control study on a population.
They also did weld people's doors shut and made them starve to death in their apartments. So again, probably difficult a bad to get
country good numbers out of there. I probably shouldn't even brought up that example for many reasons.
Yeah. Sure, I would say the counter to that is then you also have South Korea and Japan that are similar. Because I completely agree with you. It's hard to trust the information coming out of China because they have a stake in this. They're largely blamed for this virus. So absolutely correct in that. But then when you look at, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan next to them, who also have those very low levels, that it starts to become suspicious to me. And why are they so low compared to the U.S.? Not even close.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we're seeing, spikes in the U.S. in densely populated cities, despite these really tyrannical mask mandates and these high measures of prevention. So, what does that tell us?
Yeah, that makes sense. If we don't think that masks are necessarily that effective, and you have a densely populated area where people are close, then yeah, I would expect those numbers to skyrocket. And that's why it's interesting that Japan isn't seeing that, considering that they are close and doing masks as well. So it makes sense. I would expect the cities to go up a lot in their infection. I think that if the masks were really that effective, or 70% effective, as the CDC tries to say, then it seems like you wouldn't have such a dramatic upswing.
Yeah. Does it infuriate you as much as it infuriates me to see the massive transfer in wealth from small businesses to large corporations that generally are bending the knee at every turn to whatever leftists and media tells them is the popular, sort of public orthodoxy, like whatever it is they're supposed to support or do or give their money to? Those people, the Jeff Bezos of the world, are just absolutely killing it right now, and small business owners are being threatened and coerced on a regular basis into losing their businesses, losing their homes, and at the other end of it, you have the media and Democrat politicians saying, you just got to this is for everybody else, it's for the greater good. Is that infuriating to you?
Absolutely. They say, and this is even, the World Health Organization has even stated this, that this pandemic affects the impoverished and the poverty, the impoverished the most. You have, when you look at the number of deaths worldwide from poverty or from, tuberculosis, for instance, and, cancer, those deaths are far greater than the number of people that are dying from COVID. And every single time a country does these lockdowns, it drives more people into poverty, delays treatment for tuberculosis. And then that extends even further, as you said, to small businesses, even to the middle class, people who have spent their, whole 10 years, 20 years building up their business. And now they're stuck in a situation where they can't do it profitably. They either are limited to 50% occupancy or trying to build a semi-outdoor structure that maybe counts for, having some small number of customers at least. And it's a struggle. I've seen in my own area, multiple businesses that have gone under in the past 6 months because of this. One of them, which is a town favorite, hasn't been open since March, and so it's taking its effect across everyone. And then you, just like you said, you have the Costco's, the Walmarts, any large, basically Fortune 500 company is able to stay open. Mm-hmm. You can crowd as much as you want to go shop and stuff, but if you're at a restaurant or mom and pop business, it's not considered essential, and you're out of luck, and then you have to suffer. Well, Amazon and Jeff Bezos is just killing it with everyone ordering everything online now.
Yeah.
Yes, mm-hmm. I think that's really concerning. Just that it seems that our financial system is destroying the individual, the family, small businesses, but not, it's not going to affect these major corporations, these billionaires, which is so ironic because the left likes to talk about helping the little guy, how these billionaires have these, they don't have to pay taxes and all this stuff, but this whole process is directly enriching them and doing the exact opposite to the middle and lower class.
And what's amazing is people like Nancy Pelosi refusing to do another stimulus to help those people because she thought it might help Trump in the election. And even now still is holding back from doing it because she wants to make Trump look bad. Between now, she would love to hold this out until, in her mind, Biden would be in office and she could give Biden a win on, week one. Mm-hmm. It's just disgusting that that's where we're at.
There's so many political games that are going on, which is really sad when you're looking at people's lives at stake. It's easy to sit there and play politics games when you're up in an ivory tower, but there are people on the ground that are suffering at all different levels.
Yeah.
The one thing that's interesting about the stimulus packages and stuff is, the stimulus packages certainly are helping people when they come out. Generally, you're devaluing the dollar, and then I think that a large part of these bailouts is going to corporations, so they're they're profiting as well. Which it'll be interesting seeing the long-term effects of this, rapid influx and stimulus of trillions of dollars. So we're talking about $4 or $5 trillion over the past 7 months, and what that will do to the strength of the dollar, which is kind of the proposition for how I manage my alternative cryptocurrency investments, like Bitcoin. Yeah. That's kind of the hedge against that. But to get back to your point, there's a lot of political games going on. It's sad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'd love to redirect the conversation, because I feel like we have so many shared views, on that, what's happening politically. But to speak to your medical expertise, and while we have you on today, with these masks, the precedent has been set here that the government essentially has the right to make medical decisions and interventions. So what does that look like now? Because if the government has the right to impair your breathing, put a mask on your face, what else now for the greater good, for the collective betterment, can they do? Is this just a vehicle or a means to get the COVID vaccine mandatory?
Yes. So I think that it's definitely a stepping stone where, get people comfortable with these governors making these mandates, such as masks. And then the next step is vaccines. Now, I think that the government, and there's enough people fighting back on mandatory vaccines and masks, where I think the governors will be, most of them it is, not all of them, will be a little reluctant to directly impose vaccine mandates for the general population. But I think they'll do it in a more surreptitious manner, which would look like businesses, health insurance. If you want to have health insurance through your employer, you have to have a vaccine. If you want to work in a space that deals with retail or deals with customers, you need a vaccine. You want to fly on an airplane, well, you have to have a vaccine. And so school for kids, they already kind of do that with the other vaccines, where if you don't have them, your kids might not be able to go to that school. And so that would be an easy way for them to really capture 80, 90% of the population in getting this vaccine without looking necessarily like the bad guys. So it's the employers, it's the schools that are saying, just a requirement, we all got to do our part. Which I think it's very early for these vaccines to go ahead and vaccinate, 500 million people globally, or 100, 200 million people in the US. I think that people should be able to elect to get the vaccine if they want, but when you're challenging their ability to work and go to school, and that's essentially forcing them into getting a vaccine.
Right. Well, it's essentially what they've done with the masks.
Right. Exactly. Like if you, and I guess they've actually made it mandatory in some homes when you have a guest over to wear a mask. But yeah, largely, if you don't want to wear a mask, then you can't go outside. In some, like in DC,
you can't participate in polite society.
Right. Absolutely. To talk about the
comments you made, you said in the case of the Pfizer vaccine, it sounds worse than COVID for many young people, causing days of headaches, fever, and muscle aches after first injection. Oh, and you have to get the injection twice, and you still have to wear masks, and we don't know the long-term side effects. I think that was a great, you tweeted that. I think it was great. But as a thought experiment for people to actually go down that road and think about, the power you're giving government. In that case, they're admitting that these side effects exist, and we are giving the government the power to be able, whether it's by straight mandate or more surreptitiously, like you said, going through businesses and basically saying you can't participate in society without it. We're giving them the power to impose side effects on us when you may be super pro-vaccine. This is the argument I've made is, I'm not anti-vax, I'm pro-safety. And I hate the term anti-vax anyways, because again, it goes back to the whole science asking questions being a denial of science, but in this case, this is the most rushed vaccine in history. That's not a debatable point. And, when you get into that, you don't have the time, just purely by the constraints of time. You do not have the time to have done the studies necessary to say, I can 100% say, or 99% say that long-term, you are going to, not see any of these side effects, or that you will see only these, or that you'll see none. We don't have the time to be able to say that yet. So, I would just argue, just based on the American value of freedom, we cannot stand for a system that imposes that type of force on people.
Yeah, so I agree. And even at the very basic level, you say, okay, these vaccines are effective. I still don't think that they should be mandatory.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. But then to go to the next level where, as you said, this is a vaccine that's been in development for about 6 months or so now. And it's a very unique vaccine. This is an mRNA vaccine. They've been working on trying to get an mRNA vaccine to work for many years. They've been working on this because it's a very, like, from a scientific standpoint, this vaccine is a great breakthrough. It's amazing that you're able to take an mRNA and inject it in the body with a certain, attachment, where you're able to have the body manufacture this protein and then have your immune system react to it and build immunity to it. It's a very exciting breakthrough for vaccines. The downside to that is, though, it's new, it's novel. We don't really know what the effects will be. And there is very limited data on that. So for instance, with the Pfizer and Moderna, they're pretty much, the studies have been kind of similar. They vaccinated about 40,000+ people, and a very small number actually became infected with COVID, either in the control group or the vaccinated group. It was about, I think, just under 100 in both Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine. And then it was shown, right, 93. I don't know. I think they've added maybe a little bit more since then in another interim analysis. I'm not sure, but right. So 93, and then they're sitting there saying, like, it's shown that it's a 90 to 95% effective rate. So most of those 93 people did not get the vaccine and then tested positive. So that's just the traditional COVID course. But it's a very small number of people that actually got the vaccine and then still got COVID, which it's an important thing to look at, because vaccines can sometimes make the disease course worse if you do eventually catch the infection. There are viruses out there where it results in antibody-dependent enhancement, ADE, where your immune system then kind of goes overload, which COVID has a very interesting relation with the immune system, which can result in cytokine storm, which is the way it rapidly declines, your health declines. And so I don't think having 7-8 people who got the vaccine and then still developed COVID is enough to know what the side effects are from this. And that's even just in the shorter term, in the year or two.
Yeah.
Extending further out, we certainly don't have any idea how this vaccine is going to impact people 5-10 years from now. We can hope for the best, but when you're talking about vaccinating 100 million Americans, those numbers are big now. That 10% that will still get infected, now you're talking about a lot of people. You're talking about a 25-year-old maybe who would have had a 99.99, 97% chance of surviving this disease, had the vaccine, which now increased his risk of actually dying, and he ended up dying from it. Like, you have these young people who are very low risk, and now you want to inject them twice a year with real side effects and with a largely unknown vaccine. I think this certainly should be tailored toward those higher risk and then given the option to do that. And that's something that I would say on every level in this pandemic, we really haven't improved it all over the last 6 months. We know a lot more now compared to March about the infection fatality rates, whether patients should be ventilated right away, and how effective lockdowns are. And we really haven't changed the plan at all. We are still doing rudimentary lockdowns. We're still don't have enough maybe N95 masks for the general public, which debate on how effective those are, but it's certainly going to be better than a surgical mask, I would say, most likely. We have these mass general population mandates, which really I think it should be focused on those higher risk. We know that this affects the people that are over 70 the most, especially the elderly in nursing homes, and we haven't really changed any of that at all. We haven't changed our focus on those at high risk. It's still just blanket lockdowns, blanket mandates for everyone.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and also, I don't know if you want to get into those other mass studies that they've used, which I'm assuming are the same studies that were still around when there was like H1N1 and other pandemics. I don't know what science changed based on that evidence, because they weren't requiring masks on mandates then. Yeah. And I understand the difference, in transmission rates and all that, but still, just the idea that you could potentially save a life. I don't understand why that wouldn't connect there. But to the point for N95 masks, those studies show that it also, a variable of how long you're wearing it could present potential ramifications. I know particularly in pregnant women, that was something notable that I remember from reading that study. Do you have any information or insight on those studies?
Yeah, it's been a little bit since I've looked at them. They, weren't really, to my knowledge, they didn't show a big difference between N95 mask and surgical masks when you're looking at, I think, in hospital workers becoming infected and transmissions. So again, that's why I say maybe they're more effective than a surgical mask, or maybe they're both not very effective at all. And then I do know from my own experience wearing it in N95, it's not a comfortable experience for long term. It's,
Right.
Your airway is certainly restricted. It's something where you can wear it for 5 to 10 minutes to enter a patient's room, hospital room, and do what you need to do, but it's not something that you can wear for long periods of time. I know, and a lot of my physician colleagues try wearing it for, a substantial part of their day when they're interacting with patients, and you can't do it. This is not a mask you can wear for many hours. You become lightheaded, you have headaches. And even in a shorter time course, it's not a fun experience. I don't think it's realistic for people to generally walk around with N95 masks on. But I do think for those at higher risk, if they do want to do a brief foray out, or go to the store and kind of pick up a few items, then I think that would probably be your best shot if you want to remain protected. And that would, I think, it could be more effective than a surgical mask. But yeah, this is something that would be very difficult for the general public to just all wear surgical masks, or if we wear N95 masks, because of those reasons. And we don't even really know. I don't know if there's a lot of good evidence out there to show the decreased oxygenation, or whether it becoming contaminated, how all that increased your risk of infection either.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how we're focusing on the science, but like our lived experiences don't seem to matter in the equation, because if they're so comfortable, why do people want to take them off when they get home? Why not wear them when you're sleeping and showering? And there's something to be said for just reality. It's uncomfortable. It does impair your breathing.
Yeah.
So
I remember you almost, when we lived in Los Angeles, we had really bad wildfires by our house once where we had to evacuate and go somewhere. We had to wear N95 masks, and I remember you almost passed out with them on. And you had a really bad headache, and you had to pull over.
Yeah.
And this is something. These masks are not the
it's
N95
not a one size fits all.
Are not a one size fits all.
Just like vaccines are not a one size fits all.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep, I completely agree.
So I wanted to bring something up. Landon, actually, she showed this to me, and I found it really interesting. My family's from Cuba, so this is something that I thought was really interesting. So I have this chart in front of me that compares communist coercion methods for getting individual compliance, and alongside it, one that outlines the methods for getting COVID-19 compliance. Both use isolation, monopolization of perception, induced stability, threats and intimidation, allowing occasional indulgences, demonstration of omnipotence, omnipotence. I'm reading too quickly. Humiliation and degradation techniques, and enforcing trivial demands. Am I wrong to think we're witnessing a long-scale societal coercion scheme for the elite, particularly the left, to gain more control?
It's certainly possible, and to kind of, I think, give a real-world example maybe of that a little bit, is they're really disrupting in-person communication. They're really, I mean, they're saying lockdown. They're saying if you do go out in public, stay 6 feet away from someone, wear a mask. They're doing everything they can to discourage real-world communication. And so what this does is this is pushing people obviously to YouTube, social media platforms. And then what's happening there? They control that information flow. It's very difficult for them to control you talking with friends, or you even on the phone, but instead, they're pushing people to social media platforms. They control the narrative. And so it's just giving them ultimately more control over free speech, I think.
Yeah.
And ultimately more control, of our health and choices and information. I mean, and I'm sure you're familiar with the Great Barrington Declaration. Over 50,000 doctors and scientists signed it. Now it has over 700,000 scientists, academics, doctors, and citizens worldwide that have signed this in opposition of these lockdowns. How many of these doctors and scientists do you think have been silenced and suppressed, intimidated, threatened? Because I haven't seen hardly any, I mean, we had to go digging for doctors like yourself that had any sort of alternative viewpoint.
Yeah, so you have a couple things. So first of all, I was up on a panel with Dr. Bhattacharya. He's one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, smart guy. Was actually one of the first ones to do the Stanford study that showed that the infection fatality rate of this virus is actually much lower than people had thought at the time. And if you remember, that study and himself were just persecuted by the mainstream media. And then it turns out he was largely correct, that the infection fatality rates really are that low. But you have two things going on a little bit. You have a lot of physicians and scientists who are afraid to put it out there that they have a contrarian viewpoint on this pandemic. And the reason largely being is because they're kind of beholden to these academic institutions. You can't work for Stanford generally or Johns Hopkins and then go out on social media saying, I believe this. You're going to, just like we saw with Scott Atlas, just like we saw with Dr. Bhattacharya, with Dr. Harvey Risch, where the organization, the faculty then will turn against you. They'll isolate you. They'll send a petition to the president to say, remove this person from faculty. And so a lot of those physician scientists are afraid to speak up. And I know that some that privately agree with everything I'm saying, but they wouldn't dare go out in public and say that for fear of their retaliation from their hospital or essentially the system they work in. I'm a little bit unique that I don't work for anyone, so I can say things and just I'll get attacked by mainstream media, sure, but it's not like I have to answer to an administrator about it. And then there's absolutely censorship going on. I know many physicians who keep getting censored on Twitter, and I've noticed it for me. I can tell they're playing games with the algorithm in some way where they'll be after doing after that, when I tweeted out about that Danish mask study, Twitter mass removed about 2,000 likes within 1 minute, and they never gave me them back. It kind of organically grew back up to 16,000, 17,000 likes or whatever. And then I noticed the next day my engagement was really low, which unprecedentedly low for the last 3 or 4 months. So I know that they're all playing games and engagement and narratives, and similar with the trending on Twitter. It's the main narrative, mainstream media narrative trends.
And it lends people to think that, wow, there really are no doctors or experts speaking out about this, and that couldn't be further from the truth. And yes, there's situations where the whole system is kind of designed against individuals and them practicing medicine the way they want to practice it. Doctors are now being told by certain I don't know if it's pharmacies or who's giving these directives, but they can't prescribe certain medicines that they've traditionally prescribed. They went to medical school, and they're being told by bureaucrats that they can't prescribe certain medications. They're playing. It's a dangerous game when we have these people playing medicine when they are not authorized to be making medical decisions. Does that worry you?
Well, absolutely. So that's something I've been harping on since March. When we wrote that paper that received widespread attention and proposing hydroxychloroquine as a treatment, this is a very old medication, 65-year-old FDA-approved medication. What was most dangerous to me to see governors interfere with that patient-doctor relationship. To date, we've never seen, besides a situation where governors or medical boards were threatening physicians for prescribing a medication that's FDA approved. Right. You just did not see that. And then all of a sudden it just flipped just like that, where you have these governors, these bureaucrats saying you can't prescribe that or you could lose your license, you could lose your livelihood, which is not how medicine is going to work. Those are supposed to work. Those bureaucrats did not receive medical degrees. It's very concerning about the medical profession.
Do you believe people have lost their lives due to this? To not having access to, medical life-saving medications, or for their doctors being hindered in some way from practicing the way that they see fit?
I think so. I think the question is how many lives, which I don't, unfortunately the science and studies around hydroxychloroquine have become kind of so corrupted. It's hard to sift through it now to determine what's real, what's not. And there still hasn't been a whole lot of great evidence for its early use, against it. So I don't know how many lives have suffered because of this, but I know many patients are very upset that their physician wouldn't prescribe them this medication when, for many of them, it was probably worst case scenario. It does nothing because it's an old medication. It's well known. you know. And so I know it's upset a number of patients, including even higher up, patients who are within the government, within, state senators, state congressmen, who are very upset that they weren't able to get this medication.
Yep.
Right.
We have a question from a viewer. Sunkiss221 asked, what effect, if any, will the increased use of hand sanitizer and other disinfectants have on increasing superbugs and antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the future? Is that a concern?
That's a tough question. So it was actually, I did a little study on that back in college. We're talking about 15 or so years ago. And, because that was an interesting question to me is, if you are using this 99.99, 7% hand sanitizer that gets rid of most bacteria, are you basically just isolating the ones that will become superbugs that are resistant to it? And I haven't seen any solid evidence over the last, I haven't been following that too closely, but I haven't seen the evidence of these superbugs arising from overuse of hand sanitizer. It's certainly theoretically a possibility, but I don't know.
A follow-up was any concerns, say, if let's pretend masks are effective to some degree and, it's holding you back from being able to gain immunities to things and be exposed to things in small quantities in a way that we traditionally have in the past. Is that a concern?
Yeah, so we're assuming that the masks are somewhat effective. So there's a hypothesis out there. I think it's called the hygienic hypothesis or hygiene hypothesis, that we are potentially kind of suppressing our immune system. We're basically turning it into an inactive state where we're no longer getting exposure to a bunch of different viruses, not just coronavirus or flu virus, but there are many other ones as well. And due to this inactivity, we won't have that kind of cross-reactive response if we do eventually become infected with the novel coronavirus or the influenza virus. And I think that's very concerning to me. I do know, I have three young children. So before this pandemic started, we got sick a lot. They were always
we have 3 kids too.
Right, so there you go. So we had, it felt like every 3 weeks there's another kid sick, and then they'd pass it on to my wife. And I was a little bit more resistant to it, but probably every month someone in the family was sick. And it's very interesting. Over the past, 7-8 months, we haven't gotten sick at all, which we can think, okay, well, I guess those measures are, social distancing. We don't really wear masks that often, but the social distancing thing, and maybe that's helping decrease infections. But the counter to that is I'm very worried now that my young kids who I have, one of them is less than a year old and has never been sick in her life. So, and then the other one is about 2 years old. And so I wonder how the immune system is able to handle an infection when it does present itself, when they really have been in a little bit of a bubble now for so long. And that goes for anyone. That goes for us too. Although I think by now we probably have a little bit more of a robust and long-lasting immune system. But I'm worried about how kids will do with this, especially because they have normally a very high survival rate with this disease. But now we're compromising it where that will be different.
Right. And I think there's something to be said too by this unnatural, covering on your mouth where, you're essentially have a moist environment for bacteria to grow. And hasn't there been, studies on, bacterial pneumonia and increased or prevalence of respiratory complications as a result of wearing like a cloth mask or just, keeping that moist environment, rebreathing that?
So I know the Danish mask study, part of their trial was to study that, but unfortunately they didn't publish really anything about those outcome endpoints in their study, which I think was very unfortunate because it would be nice to see that. So I'm not sure what evidence outside of that study is robust for showing, increased risk of bacterial pneumonia versus otherwise, which there might be a couple out there that I just don't know about. I would say though, when you're talking about kids wearing masks, they are sucking on that mask. It is a very moist, wet thing. They're touching it constantly. It falls on the ground. They put it on their mouth. You just can't in your right mind think that this is going to be better than not wearing a mask for a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old.
Well, and psychologically, I have probably more concern psychologically than I do physically for kids wearing them versus not wearing them, because I see them physically, what they're doing doesn't make sense. It just seems totally illogical to me because they're so irresponsible with it. Even if it did work for adults, like the way kids are with it, my personal opinion, no scientific backing for it, because there hasn't been some wide-scale randomized control study of kids, but just watching them with my own eyes and experience on Earth, I don't think it's doing anything except for possibly getting their mouth dirty. But outside of that, psychologically, kids are being scarred by this experience. I've been in a store before at the beginning of the pandemic, and I'll never forget this for the rest of my life. Turn the corner, and a kid sees me, and I'm wearing a mask because they made me wear one in the store. And this is at the beginning of the slow the spread, where everybody was kind of like, okay, you know what, we'll humor everybody, we'll do it for, whatever. We go in, I turn the corner, kid looks up at me, and she recoiled back, like she was scared. This is not like a natural human reaction for kids when they look over. I've never had a kid do that in my life. It's so strange, and it was the mask. And kids aren't seeing faces anymore to see, how does this person feel? Oh, they're being warm to me. They're smiling at me. They're not making a mean face or whatever it is. And also to see if somebody is making a mean face. Oh, this kid's scowling at me. They must not be very nice. Stay away. We're not getting social cues and teaching them these things that are very important. So are you concerned long-term about that?
Yeah, I would completely agree. I mean, all the way down from babies, they're looking at your mouth, they're seeing your expression, you smiling, and they're reacting, they're smiling back. It's a lot of that child development is based on those social cues and seeing how, mom or dad is looking at you. And that's where they learn that. And so I don't know we've never done this before, to my knowledge, internationally. So I don't know the long-term effects of this, but I know there are, child psychologists and psychiatrists, pediatric psychiatry that don't think this is good for children development on multiple levels. And this is all the way from, the social cues from masks to just the stress this is putting on teenagers, especially in the absence of social settings, especially if that's their support group. And so all kids are, kids of all ages, I think, are suffering from this pandemic on multiple levels from all these artificial constraints on society.
Absolutely. And that's why we're seeing, increased rate of sexual abuse, physical abuse. It has a effect that is really, it's devastating when you see the other effects that it has, and not just hyperfixating on the physicality, around the mask. Yeah.
I do. I have a last question. Yeah. So this is sort of off topic, okay? But it's somewhat on topic, but it's just, I had to throw this in there. So it's a two-parter. The first part is the Emmys have announced that they're giving a special Emmy to Governor Cuomo in New York. How do you feel about the fact that you can be awarded for having the highest death total in raw numbers in the United States, and having the second highest case fatality rate, and having one of the highest case fatality rates in the world on planet Earth? Does that make any sense to you?
That's the lengths that the mainstream media, how much control, as we talked about earlier, their ability to make reality. They were able to take the governor of the state that had the worst outcome with this pandemic, not even close. I think New York was over a half of the deaths for a while, the daily deaths for the entire country. Yep. And then, close. Right, not even close. And then the decisions that were made on nursing homes who were most, affected, whether he knew that or not, whatever, but the good decisions were not made. This is not an Emmy awarding experience. This is something where, okay, New York is densely populated, and we saw that you didn't have a good response to it. Maybe it wasn't necessarily a terrible response compared to other governors, but it certainly wasn't a good response. So
and don't stick old people, COVID patients, in with non-COVID patients,
right.
With a bunch of old people trapped in a building. That seemed like common sense to me, and the Trump administration opposed that move at the time. And of course, if they oppose anything, the left just goes further with it. So they then copied it in other places, and it was a disaster. They killed over 10,000 old people. And then the second part of the question is, California has deemed Hollywood as an essential business while closing small businesses. I'm curious, can you tell me what science says this is a good decision?
Well, you know, when people are sitting in their homes locked down, they got to watch something. So that's why it's so essential. No, there's really, and again, it's moving all the money, moving all the money from the, you know, the small business owners to the Jeff Bezoses of the world, Hollywood, all these, you know, all these industries that are already, you know, doing very well, and it's all coming from the little people.
Yep. Thank you, James. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Todaro.
If you don't mind, will you stay on?
Todaro,
I'm going to end the stream, but I had one other thing I wanted to ask you for a friend.
Sure, of course.
Bye, guys.
Thanks for listening.